So self-assessment, and really thinking about this as a tool to encourage metacognition, students to think about how they're learning, also to encourage risk-taking and self-reflection as part of an integral to their learning process. Um, One of the reasons why I was thinking about using self-assessment in studio classes is because conventional grading has lots of different issues. There's still a lot of value to certain types of conventional grading. Um, but in some ways, it reinforces the kind of classroom hierarchies that we've come to expect in classrooms with with the instructor holding all of the authority, the grade. It can disproportionately favor certain students. So I actually, growing up, was always one of those students who knew how to get an A. That didn't necessarily mean that I was learning anything, but I was one of those students who knew how to do that. And I think there are others like me out there who know, even in a creative classroom, how to get that great grade without necessarily proving that they've learned anything. And I think in a design studio in particular, it really raises this question around like, what is the right answer? One of the issues we face in design studios is actually knowing when to stop, because there is no perfect right answer. And so this kind of helps with that reflective process. So we looked at lots of different students over a couple of different years and engaged in surveys, focus groups. I was not involved in the focus groups. That's where the student research assistants were involved, among other types of metrics, including adding additional questions to the course evaluation at the end of the class. And this is what you're looking at here is some findings from one of the surveys that we sent out. And this is really thinking about where students are most encouraged to perform well in a class. So one of the things that I'm really happy about is that being around inspiring people and settings is the top reason why students find that they do best in a class, at least in this particular context. Second is enthusiasm of the professor and their peers, which is also really encouraging to know that just creating the right type of learning environment in and of itself is still seen as very inspiring to students. Coming in the middle is the good grade piece. And I think it's complicated because you could also link a good grade to a good job and some of these other competition, some of these other metrics on here as well. So what we did during from 2021 to 2023, and bear in mind there is some interesting dynamics with the pandemic affecting kind of the first 2 years, was to replace instructor-only grades, so me as the instructor, with a series of different interventions throughout the semester that included goal setting, included self-evaluations, and then brief calibration meetings that I held with the individual students. As I mentioned, we drew data from surveys, from self-assessment forms that the students completed, as well as course evaluation questions and focus groups. And our goal then was to redirect focus from points to evidence of growth and assessment literacy. So how students understand what they're learning. And our process was that first students would, well, I should back up just a little bit. At the beginning of the semester, I really wanted students to think about a goal that they had for that class. And I think this was setting up a sort of tone and language around self-reflection. So at the beginning of the class, week one, I asked everyone to think back on some of their past experiences in a studio class and what's one thing they wanted to work on this semester. It could be anything. It could be waking up earlier, or it could be perfecting a particular type of skill, interpersonal relation, just anything that got them in the mindset. And then we would often reflect on that throughout the semester, checking in at midterm and again at the end of the semester to see how they actually did in meeting that goal. So the scaffolded reflection process, this is the way in which students actually graded themselves in the class. I started out by giving them a traditional rubric that I would use in any design studio class after a milestone submission. So maybe students in the case of interior design, probably similar in an architecture studio, maybe we reach a milestone after about 2 or 3 weeks, looking at concept development, things of that nature. So that would be their first grading opportunity. And I would give them a rubric with weights and learning outcomes in the rubric, and they would have to complete it based on how they thought they did. The next time there was a learning, an assessment moment, I gave them a rubric again, but this time I allowed them to adjust the weights. So there particular things about the project that they felt like they spent a little more time on or were more valuable and important to their particular growth in the class. So for instance, maybe one student was having challenges with oral presentation. And so they worked really hard on giving a great oral presentation. They may intentionally bump the weight of that particular criteria on the rubric up to reflect the work that they did in that space and the value that that had to their own learning and growth in the classroom. And then finally, they were able to adjust the criteria themselves. So when they turned in their final projects, there were some fixed learning outcomes that I wanted to make sure were captured in the rubric, but I also allowed them to write some of their own. So if, again, there were things that maybe aligned with their goal that they set for the class or other accomplishments they were looking to align with that particular class, they were able to do that as well. At both the midterm and the final, their review and using the rubric was coupled with a sort of larger self-assessment that they had to do to reflect on their growth and learning throughout the class, and then also meet with me for a one-on-one session where we could talk about where I saw their growth and how that maybe differed from or aligned with how they were reflecting on their own growth in that class. This was one of the feedback moments from one of the students talking really about um, how this tool helped them understand their own learning, and also I think had a longer lasting tail because it helped them understand a little bit about what we go through when we're assessing and grading projects. So there's a added value in the skill of actually being able to articulate a a reflection that could be used for other people's works as well, not just their own, even though this was really focused on self-assessment. I already mentioned this a little bit, but this was the goal setting. And so just to give you a little more framework, this not only asked them to kind of come up with a goal, but I also wanted to highlight their strengths in the studio. What do they think they're really good at? What do they think are their challenges? And then how can they set a goal to address some of those challenges? What do they need? So I think that's really important too, to just cut students loose with a goal and then not providing the support is perhaps problematic. Not that I can necessarily provide all the types of support, like setting an alarm an hour earlier to get up to be on class on time, but I can at least talk to them a little bit about how they might address time management. And then I also gave them cues to think about how they could start addressing that goal on a step-by-step basis. So the challenges of using this kind of a system, one, definitely it's more time consuming. So there is a lot more interaction that happens with you and the student in those one-on-ones. They actually have to fill out more things. They're not just getting a grade and receiving that. There's also the issue. I'm going to skip the abuse thing because I think that that just doesn't show up very much as you would think. Students giving themselves a higher grade, perhaps, than they think that you think they deserve. Um, but I will highlight this one, and that is there is a particular thing I noticed with some underrepresented groups who assess themselves more harshly than perhaps how we might have assessed them. That's why those one-on-one meetings were particularly helpful because that's when we can calibrate some of those things. And I can say, you actually did really well on this. I know you think maybe for your own standards or whatever you're measuring yourself up against was not. In fact, you did great. And let's talk about why you thought you didn't. Um, and finally, I'll just leave here with some additional resources. I'll point to number 3, which came out in the midst of the pandemic at an important time, and that is the book called Ungrading, which is a really interesting resource that looks at how you can remove grades from your class. And in this case, we still have to give grades. We're required. There's visa connection, all sorts of interesting stuff. This is a mechanism to allow students to have that opportunity to assess themselves, remove some of the formality of the grading process, and still have something to turn in at the end of the semester to the registrar's office. So that's what I have for you. I'll stop sharing this screen. And I have a minute left. Look at that.